It was just another ordinary day, or so it seemed. The sun was shining, the streets were buzzing with life, and the world felt like it was moving at its usual pace. But for one woman, that ordinary day was about to take a turn she never saw coming. Imagine this. You're driving home, minding your own business, when suddenly flashing lights appear in your rearview mirror. Your heart skips a beat. What did I do wrong? You wonder. But as you pull over, the sinking feeling in your gut tells you this isn't about a broken taillight or a speeding ticket. This is about something deeper, something uglier. This is about the color of your skin. Meet Keisha, a strong, confident black woman who's no stranger to the challenges of navigating a world that doesn't always see her for who she truly is. She's a mother, a wife, and a professional who's worked hard to build a life she's proud of. But none of that mattered in this moment. As the white police officer approached her car, his demeanor was cold, his tone sharp. There was no polite greeting, no explanation for why he'd stopped her. Just a demand for her license and registration. Keisha's hands trembled as she reached for her glove compartment, her mind racing. She knew this drill all too well, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. The officer's questions were pointed, his accusations vague. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, though it was clear he didn't have a real answer. Keisha stayed calm, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. She knew better than to react, to give him any reason, to escalate the situation. But as the minutes dragged on, the tension grew thicker. Passers-by began to notice, their curious glances turning into concerned stares. Keisha felt exposed, vulnerable, and angry, all at once. Why was this happening? What had she done to deserve this? Just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse? A familiar voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Is there a problem here?" It was Marcus, Keisha's husband, who had been driving behind her and noticed the commotion. Marcus was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a presence that commanded respect. But it wasn't just his physical stature that made the officer freeze. It was the way he carried himself, the authority in his voice, and the fire in his eyes. Marcus wasn't just any husband. He was a former Marine with a reputation for standing up for what was right. The officer's demeanor shifted instantly. His once authoritative tone softened. His posture stiffened, and for the first time since the stop began, he seemed unsure of himself. Keisha watched in disbelief as the dynamic changed before her eyes. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Marcus wasn't about to let this slide. He had questions and he wanted answers. Why had his wife been stopped? What was the reason for this harassment? The officer stumbled over his words, his excuses flimsy and unconvincing. The tension in the air was palpable, and it was clear this confrontation was far from finished. As the scene unfolded, Keisha couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Relief that Marcus was there, anger at the injustice of it all, and fear of what might happen next. The officer's badge gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of authority that felt more like a threat in this moment. But Marcus wasn't backing down. He stood tall, his voice steady but firm, demanding accountability. The standoff between the two men was electric, a silent battle of wills that left everyone watching on edge. And then, just as it seemed like the situation might explode, something unexpected happened. The officer's radio crackled to life, and a voice on the other end delivered a message that made his face pale. He muttered something under his breath, his eyes darting between Keisha and Marcus. Without another word, he turned on his heel and hurried back to his patrol car, leaving the couple standing there in stunned silence. What had just happened? What did that message say? And more importantly, what did it mean for Keisha and Marcus? As the officer drove away, the questions lingered unanswered. Keisha and Marcus exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The encounter had left them shaken, but it had also ignited a fire within them, a determination to seek justice, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure that no one else had to endure what they just had. But as they got back into their cars and drove away, one thought weighed heavily on their minds. What would happen next? The officers' sudden departure felt like the calm before the storm, and they couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Keisha and Marcus weren't going to let this go. They had each other, and they had their voices, and sometimes that's all you need to spark a change. But as they disappeared into the distance, the question remained, what would that change look like? And how far were they willing to go to fight for it? The story was far from over, and the next chapter promised to be even more intense. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. As Keisha and Marcus drove away from the scene, the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. The silence between them was deafening, each lost in their own thoughts. Keisha gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white, while Marcus stared out the window, his jaw clenched. The encounter had shaken them both, but in different ways. For Keisha, it was a painful reminder of the countless times she'd been made to feel small, invisible, or worse, like a threat, simply because of the color of her skin. For Marcus, it was a surge of protectiveness mixed with rage. He had spent his life serving his country, fighting for justice and freedom, only to come home and see his wife treated like a criminal for no reason. The couple didn't speak until they pulled into their driveway. The familiar sight of their home, with its neatly trimmed lawn and flower pots lining the porch, should have been comforting. But today, it felt like a fragile sanctuary, a temporary escape from a world that seemed determined to test them. As they stepped inside, Keisha finally broke the silence. "What just happened back there?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know, Keisha, but I'm not letting this go. That cop had no right to treat you like that." Keisha nodded, but her mind was racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Why had the officer stopped her in the first place? And why had he left so abruptly? It didn't add up. She thought back to the moment when Marcus had stepped in, how the officer's demeanor had changed. It was almost as if he recognized Marcus. Or maybe he was afraid of him. But why? Marcus was just a regular guy, a family man who worked hard and minded his own business. Sure, he had a military background, but that didn't explain the officer's reaction. As the hours passed, Keisha found herself replaying the incident over and over in her mind. She thought about the way the officer had looked at her, the way his voice had dripped with condescension. It wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It felt personal. And then there was the radio call. What had the dispatcher said that made him leave so suddenly? Keisha couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger at play here, something she wasn't seeing. Meanwhile, Marcus was already taking action. He had spent years in the Marines learning how to assess situations, gather intel, and act decisively. This was no different. He pulled out his laptop and started researching. He wanted to know everything he could about the officer who had stopped Keisha. His name, his badge number, his history. But the more he dug, the more questions he had. The officer's name was Greg Harris, a 10-year veteran of the force. On paper, he seemed like a decent cop, with no major complaints or disciplinary actions against him. But Marcus knew better than to take things at face value. He had seen enough in his life to know that sometimes the truth was buried deep. As Marcus scrolled through forums and local news articles, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. A few months ago, there had been a similar incident in a neighboring town. A black woman had been pulled over by a white officer under suspicious circumstances. The details were eerily familiar. Vague accusations, no clear reason for the stop, and an abrupt ending when the woman's husband arrived on the scene. The story had barely made the news, and no one had followed up on it. But to Marcus, it was a red flag. Was this part of a pattern? Were there other women who had experienced the same thing? Keisha walked into the room, catching Marcus mid-thought. "What are you looking at?" she asked, peering over his shoulder. Marcus hesitated, not wanting to alarm her, but he knew she deserved to know the truth. He showed her the article, watching as her eyes widened in disbelief. "This "This can't be a coincidence," she said softly. Marcus nodded. "I don't think it is. There's something going on here, Keisha, and I'm going to find out what it is." The next morning, Marcus decided to reach out to the woman from the article. Her name was Tamara, and she lived about an hour away. After a few phone calls, he managed to get in touch with her. Tamara was hesitant at first, understandably wary, reopening old wounds. But when Marcus explained what had happened to Keisha, she agreed to meet. "I've been waiting for someone to take this seriously," she said. "Maybe together we can finally get some answers." The meeting took place at a small cafe halfway between their towns. Tamara was a petite woman in her late 30s, with a quiet strength that reminded Marcus of Keisha. As they sat down, she began to recount her story. It was almost identical to Keisha's: the unjust stop, the officer's hostility, the sudden change when her husband arrived. But there was one detail that stood out. Before he left, the officer said something strange, Tamara recalled. He said, "This isn't over." I didn't know what he meant at the time, but it's haunted me ever since. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Those were the same words the officer had muttered under his breath before driving away from Keisha. What did they mean? Was it a threat, a warning, or something else entirely? As Marcus and Tamara talked, they realized they weren't just dealing with a rogue cop. This was something bigger, something more organized. But who was behind it? And why were they targeting black women? Back at home, Keisha was doing her own digging. She had reached out to a local advocacy group that worked on police accountability issues. The group's leader, a woman named Denise, listened intently as Keisha shared her story. "You're not alone," Denise said. "We've been hearing similar stories from other women in the area, but no one has been able to connect the dots until now." Denise agreed to help Keisha and Marcus, offering resources and support to investigate further. As the days turned into weeks, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Marcus and Keisha discovered that Officer Harris was part of a small task force within the police department, one that operated with little oversight. The task force was supposed to focus on high-priority crimes, but there were rumors that it had been involved in questionable activities. Some even whispered that it was targeting specific communities, using traffic stops as a cover for something more sinister, but proving it was another matter. The department was tight-lipped, and anyone who tried to ask questions was met with resistance. Marcus knew they needed more evidence, something concrete that couldn't be ignored. He decided to take a risk, reaching out to an old friend from his military days who now worked in law enforcement. "I need your help," Marcus said, "but this could get messy." His friend agreed to look into it but warned Marcus to be careful. If there's something going on, they're not going to let it come out without a fight. As Marcus and Keisha waited for answers, the tension in their lives grew. Every time Keisha left the house, she felt a knot in her stomach, wondering if she'd be stopped again. Marcus, meanwhile, was consumed by the need to protect his family and uncover the truth. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. One night, as they sat together in their living room, Keisha turned to Marcus. "Do you think we're in over our heads?" she asked. Marcus took her hand, his expression serious. "Maybe. But we can't back down now. Too many people are counting on us." The story was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. As Keisha and Marcus prepared to take the next step, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The officer's words echoed in their minds. This isn't over. And they knew he was right. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than they had imagined. And the fight was just beginning.